Now you've had a glorious past and have experienced different countries. I think you got probably lots of insight into your father's job, how the UN works in many ways. You had experience to Boy Scouts and the ethics and the concepts of leadership that were taught there. You had the glorious experience of a wonderful culture of the military as well, learning from there, the good and the bad, I'm sure. You've worked in private industry. You're back in private industry now. You've had exposure to the I think political leadership in reality is the pinnacle of leadership. It's the most important, most essential to society. What are principles that you stand by, or if somebody were to ask you what principles they should consider to aspire to, what would be some of the principles that you would advise yourself or others that they have to bring to the table if they want to be an outstanding leader?
I think if you want to be an outstanding leader, you have to manage your career carefully, choose the battles wisely, ultimately be true to yourself. Don't make any decision which you look back on and regret. I worked closely with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, and he would often look at a problem and say, what is the right thing to do? It might sound very simple.
We don't ask that question often enough. That's the essential question.
It's very easy to do what's in it for me? What's in it for my party? What is actually the right thing to do?
What's the easy way to go?
Yeah. And so many times I remember him saying that. What is the correct, if we're honest about it, what would be the most sensible and courageous thing to do? And that is being then honest with the situation. And then you gain more respect. The trouble is, it's very easy to be lured to the dark side, play the game, and then end up sort of in power, but powerless because you're then tied to policy situations that you personally don't believe in. And the best example of that is Boris Johnson being tied to Brexit when he himself had written speeches on wanting to be a Remainer. He was a Remainer.
I wasn't even aware of that.
He was a complete Remainer. And he worked in Brussels as a journalist. And he would often go prior to because people already had views on Brexit, but prior to the referendum, he would go to a dinner party, a conservative dinner party, and say, is this the Brexit-leaning audience or are they Remaining? Because I have a speech in one pocket for each side. But he himself always recognized the appointment. You talked about France, Britain, and Germany being this troical, direction of travel. When those three countries agreed, that's where Europe followed. That's where Europe went.
You had momentum. You had checks and balances. You had sufficient cultural affinity and differences to make a well-balanced decision.
Yeah, and Boris is a great example of being lured and saying things because it suited him. And he changed British history because of that. There's no doubt about it. Absolutely. And I think, he will never put his hand up and admit it. And none of the Brexiteers do, to say what damage this model of Brexit has actually caused Britain. But that's it. So being true to your beliefs can be very, very tough indeed. But if you're convincing enough in your arguments and you pursue it in depth, you can then win people across, because that is true leadership. I go back to this said at the beginning. Taking people places that they didn't realize they wanted to go. That is true leadership.
If I may, I think what you said is so powerful. I'd like to translate it for the listener who might say, that's his context. I don't know how I would translate. I think it translates into every context of leadership. And I'll use my humble context as an example. I think one of the things after, being primarily working in the line organization and learning how to serve, the large structure and system, I've always had a leaning towards the more special forces type thing and the project type thing, because I like the idea of thinking outside the box, having more autonomy, knowing the rules on how to bend the rules. And one of the things, and that's how I ended up in project management as a consultant. And one of the things, and it's not easy to do, that I've always used as an adage or a mantra when I interact with clients, is I always tell my clients in a loving sort of way, I said, listen, you're not paying me to tell you what you want to hear. You're paying me in a kind, constructive, but honest sort of way what you need to hear. And I think that's a skill set that leaders must develop is the ability to authentically and convincingly tell people what they need to hear, and also to treat them mature enough so they can hear it. I often get the legitimate question back is, have you ever been fired? I said several times. But I've also been hired back by a number of companies who fired me initially because I told them what I thought, when it turns out that I was right. So I agree with you. I think at the end of the day, when you look in the mirror, you can't, and you're being held accountable for something. It's nice to be held accountable for something that you truly believe in and not whatever the populist opinion of the moment is.
No, I think that's very, very fair indeed. I think it was Hoover that said, give me one-armed economist, because economists would always say on the one hand there's this, and then the other hand there's this, when it came to giving advice on the economy. And I think the same applies more widely on geopolitics as well, is that you do need a space. You need a grouping of people. You need a red team that will tell you what you actually need to hear. Because if you don't get that from cabinet, then they are actually lying to you.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, again, our system, the way it works, is that many of those around the table might actually, certainly in our construct, are vying for your job. They want to succeed you, so they're actually quite happy to see you fail. And that is the dilemma. I would say that of all the prime ministers that we've spoken about, Margaret Thatcher was very good at allowing people to speak their minds.
Yeah.
And again, she had the big beasts of Michael Heseltine, Kenneth Clarke on one side, and you had people like Norman Lamont on the other side. And these were big beasts in British politics, but on the left and on the right around her cabinet. So she actually promoted the best. She had the best minds around the table on one condition, that when you left the cabinet room, you were all in agreement with the final decision of the day. Yeah. And you just had to suck it up, and that's where it should be. And quite
since you mentioned Maggie Thatcher, I have a split opinion on her. I'm not super knowledgeable about her, but I think this is also one of the challenges. If you were to ask me what I think conservative, and I think there's absolute legitimacy to conservative parties, but I think one of the challenges they faced, if we go back to this concept of is democracy for sale, I think the overall sentiment on the street is that they don't look out for the voter, they look out for the corporations. And you might say, yeah, but without corporations, we can't be a healthy and wealthy country. I think the big challenge is, it's not a contradiction. I believe that conservative parties can show a certain social note as well, which I think a lot of them would say doesn't exist. I don't think that it exists in the Republican Party, unfortunately. But yeah, I've done a little bit of research on you. You're a fairly prolific writer of articles. For anybody who's interested in seeing some of your expertise in it, and it's quite wide spanning. You have papers on strategy, on the European Union. I think you're somewhat an expert in the Middle East as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was fortunate to be the foreign minister responsible for the Middle East during a very interesting time when we were affected by ISIS, Daesh, and so on. But yes, and then more recently on Ukraine and Russia. So it's I've been very fortunate to meet a lot of people and engage, but also be able to speak around these things too. So it's I've been fortunate with the wide span of the globe that I've been interested in.
Yeah. For anybody who says, you know what, I found this interesting and I'd like to know what he's doing now. What are you doing now?
So I work for myself, really. I'm advising, doing a lot of geopolitical work. So any of those articles and commentary is on my website, tobiasellwood.org. And so I like to share my thoughts and so forth.